Welcome, everybody, to tonight's forum, What Does It Mean to Be Human? I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. My name is David Scobie. I'm Dean of the New School for Public Engagement here at the New School. Our division, the New School for Public Engagement, includes a range of programs and schools around different themes of interdisciplinary engaged learning, from international affairs and global studies, to media studies and writing, to urban policy and the teaching of English as a second language, as well as many others. But as the founding division, or the descendant from the founding division of the New School, we also proudly bear our university's distinctive commitment since its founding in 1919 to democratic adult education and to public programming that engages the public, especially the New York City public, on matters of public culture and public affairs fearlessly and playfully. And it's as part of that mission that we proudly continue our partnership with the New York Salon as a site for the International Battle of Ideas Festival, of which tonight's forum is part. Now in its 8th year, the Battle of Ideas, which was launched by the Institute for Ideas in London, serves as a venue and a catalyst for robust intellectual conversation about the largest social, political, economic, artistic, and as tonight, spiritual and religious issues that confront us. The London Battle of Ideas will take place in earnest at the Barbican on October 20th and 21st, but satellite ideas festivals are being held here and in India and across Europe. I think there's going to be a total of some 80 events, all told. In fact, I think it began this past weekend in Amsterdam, if I'm remembering the program right. And more events will continue in Amsterdam, in Paris, Berlin, Prague, India, and elsewhere. Here in New York, the satellite events are organized especially around the theme, what does it mean to be human? In addition to tonight's conversation, we will host here at the New School on November 13th a second forum, What Does It Mean to Be Human? Can We Still Have Faith in the Academy?, in which discussants, and I'm privileged to be one of them, will explore current changes and crises in higher education. Both of these forums owe their inspiration to our partner and collaborator, the New York Salon, an organization dedicated to creating a vibrant public sphere where all ideas can be discussed and contested deeply, openly, and inclusively. And since that's also our commitment here at the New School, I'm delighted that we're able to partner with the New York Salon in this effort and in tonight's forum. The forum will be moderated by Jean Smith, co-director of the New York Salon, who will frame it and introduce our guests.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the Dean and to the New School, and a special thank you to Pam Tillis of the New School, who has helped us put this this event together. As the Dean said, this is the first in a series of 4, so if we don't have your email, please leave it before you go so that we can keep you informed. And you will notice that we are being filmed. So if you stay, we're assuming that you're okay about being filmed and being a movie star. So anybody who doesn't want to be filmed, now's the time to leave. But I'm sure that, let's face it, we all want to be a movie star in some way or another. So I just want to set the scene. We have 4 speakers who are each going to speak between 6 and 7 minutes each, and it's my job to keep them on task. And then what we'll do is I'm going to come out and take a round of questions from the audience, then we'll come back to the panel, then we'll come out to the audience again, and then we'll come back to the panel. And I'm going to take a round of questions each time. But I want to say it's questions or comments. If you've got something to say, don't feel that you need to raise your voice at the end to try and make it sound like a question. You can either ask the question or just make a comment, but you do need to be concise because we have a lot of people and we want to get in as many people as possible. And I will wind you up if you're kind of going on a bit. So please try to be concise. And the other thing that, to bear in mind, we assume that everybody's an adult, and we assume that during the course of the discussion, some people will say things that you really strongly disagree with. Maybe they're on the panel, maybe it's somebody in the audience, but there'll be plenty of time for you to answer the people and to disagree with people. So there'll be no heckling and no interrupting of the speakers. You will get a chance to speak. So now that I've given you all the ground rules, I really should have been a school teacher, but as you know, they are really, really badly paid, and although they do a very, very worthwhile job. So the theme of this session today is I'm so spiritual, and what we want to look at here is both what's new about the current period that we're in, what are things that are specific to the US, which things have more global significance, and I suppose the underlying theme throughout all of this is the way people try to search for meaning and try to interpret their lives, in different ways. So that's going to be kind of the focus of it. And I suppose the other question is does it matter? Some people say they're religious, some people say they're spiritual. Does it matter? So I'm going to introduce the speakers to you in the order in which they are going to speak. Please don't clap until the end, because this way it will speed it up, and also the speakers won't get offended or lose their confidence if someone gets a bigger clap than they get. But they're all excellent speakers. So the first person to speak on my far right, geographically, is Courtney Bender. Courtney is an associate professor of religion at Columbia University. Her primary research fields are the sociology of religion and culture, social theory, and North American religious history. She is the author, co-author, and editor of numerous books and manuscripts. Most recently, the author of The New Metaphysicals, Spirituality and the American Religious Imagination. She served as the co-chair of the Social Science Research Council's Working Group on Spirituality, Political Engagement and Public Life, and as chair of the SSRC's current initiative on new directions in the study of prayer. The next person to speak on my left is Matthew Hudson. Matthew's a former editor at Psychology Today. He has a BS in cognitive neuroscience from Brown University and an MS in science writing from MIT. He's written for numerous publications, including Wired, Discover, Scientific American Mind, Popular Mechanics, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and the New York Times Magazine. His first book, The 7 Laws of Magical Thinking, How Irrational Beliefs Keep Us Happy, Healthy, and Sane, came out in April. I recommend everybody gets a copy. And he lives in New York City, just in case anybody wants to arrange to follow on the conversation with him. Next will be, on my immediate right, Sally Quinn. Sally is a journalist for the Washington Post. She's the author and she's an author and Washington, D.C. insider, and founded On Faith, an interactive feature on religion from the Washington Post. As editor-in-chief of On Faith, Sally hosts a panel of renowned religious scholars of all denominations, making On Faith the first worldwide interactive discussion about religion and its impact on global life. Sally has a very, very long, history, so I recommend that you look at it yourself on our website, nysalon.org. Over the past decade, Sally has actually reached out to several religious leaders as part of her, her religious education, including Bishop Desmond Tutu, Jim Anderson, Father Brian Hayhere, and John Esposito. And she's traveled all over the world to various holy sites and has written 4 books, including We're Going to Make You a Star, about her short-lived experience as a co-anchor for CBS morning news. She's currently working on a book about religion in Washington. And then the fourth speaker will be my co-director, Alan Miller, who, as I said, is a co-director of the New York Salon, and he's also the co-founder of the Truman Brewery, a 10-acre site in London's East End. The Truman Brewery now has over 200 companies ranging from recording studios to art galleries, entertainment spaces, restaurants, bars, cafes, fashion and retail. It has helped regenerate a significant area of London, creating a new cultural quarter. Alan also sat on the Arts Council's London Arts Board. Alan is a film director and has had his work broadcast internationally and writes and produces with his partners in Argosy Pictures. He writes on various cultural issues for several publications, including Spiked Online, Cultural Wars, The American, The Huffington Post, and many of you may have seen because it's caused a certain amount of controversy, most recently on CNN. So that's our speakers. Now please give them all a round of applause. And we're going to start off with Courtney.
Thank you.
Start my stopwatch.
Okay. Just watch. All right, so thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. I guess if the question tonight is, the big question is the search for meaning and why do we search for meaning the way we do, a sociologist like me will ask, well, people may or may not always search for meaning, but the question that a sociologist will be interested in is how do they get to search for meaning in the places that they do, in the kinds of ways that they do. Sociologists are always looking for the social in things, and this is sometimes quite difficult because we think of spirituality often, particularly in the American context, as being something that's very individualistic, something that is, we might even say, self-styled. And religion is often counterposed to spirituality, where religion is about groups and spirituality is about individuals. So religion is about the authority of tradition, and spirituality is about individuals' experience and the authority of individual experience, we might even say. This is a binary that I think really needs to be challenged if we're actually going to think about what it means to be spiritual in America today. This is something that spiritual people say. It's something that sociologists have also told us, but leaves out a lot of the history of the ways that spirituality takes shape in the United States and its particular forms, which are often lost in this. To just take a step back, I'd like to say that sociologists have found, or maybe a step forward, I'm not sure, sociologists have become more interested in spirituality recently because there are more and more people who are able to say on polls that they're spiritual, not religious. There are also more people who say that they're spiritual and religious, we should keep in mind, so these are not necessarily things that are kept apart. But even more than that, over the last 25 years or so, there's been an enormous growth of the number of Americans on polls who say that they are nothing. They are not religious at all. They are none, not we call them the nuns, and that always gets a laugh because it sounds like they're N-U-N-S, but it's N-O-N-E-S. But these people who are not religious, the percentage of Americans who say that they are nothing religiously has risen from around 20, 25 years ago for about 5 or 7% of the population to over 14%, and the number seems to be growing. What's really interesting about the nuns, though, is that many of them are, while they say that they're not religious, they're not Presbyterian, Jewish, or anything, they nonetheless do say that they believe in some kind of God, right? So they have some kind of theistic or divine sort of understanding of themselves or of the world. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is there are lots of things that are interesting about this. Sociologists, I have to say, have long suspected that Americans consistently overreport how religious they are. So for a very long time, to be American was to be religious. This was particularly true in the post-Cold War period and up until very recently. Sociologists who have been doing this work on the religious nuns say, well, what changed in the early 90s? And one of the first theories that's been floated, and it's sort of the most robust one, although there are a lot of interesting ones, is that basically in the 90s you actually begin to see the consequence of the congealing of religiosity with conservative politics in the United States. So what's really we see is that a number of people who were sort of nominally religious, had some kind of nominal religious identification, dropping out of any kind of religious identification because they didn't want to be connected to conservative religious groups or any conservative religion at all. So this would, of course, suggest that, and it is in fact true, that most of the nuns, many of the nuns are more liberal. They tend to be not any more educated necessarily than non-nuns. But they are also, that also suggests that there is something really interestingly enduring about this other part of the nuns, which is that many of them do say that they believe in something. So this is, I think, what a lot of people would say, oh, well, here we have spirituality in America, right? We have people dropping away from religion, and they are nonetheless looking for something, so they have embraced something called spirituality. And this then leads to all these kinds of critics of spirituality that say it's just sort of the last gasp, you know, their children won't be spiritual, we'll all become atheists. It's sort of the last remnants of something called religion. So there are two questions. One is whether or not these people are actually consider themselves spiritual, which I think is one that we actually don't know the answer to right now. But the other thing that I think that we really want to complicate is this view that spirituality is what is left once you subtract religion, religion being the group. And that is sort of, so spirituality is sort of the thing that is left. Either in the individual because there's something within us internally that is spiritual, or it's sort of whatever's left from religious growing up that's not really, you know, what we, the leftover. And I point instead, and this is where I just sort of want to leave it, I would have a lot to say about this, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say, that I think that we should think rather about spirituality as something that's been around for a very long time, that it's allowed people to say spiritual and religious, as well as spiritual not religious, and that this spirituality stuff that's been around for at least 100 years has a different characteristic than religion. I would not say that spirituality in the United States is an alternative religion. I'd say it's something that's different from religion. It has institutions like alternative medicine institutions. It has a connection to 19th century movements like theosophy and spiritualism and mesmerism and the mind cure movement. But at the same time, it is not, in fact, the same as those movements. What I think we see in spirituality is forms of people's understandings of the connection of things in the universe that are actually developed and lived and experienced through things that they actually consider to be secular, like medicine, like science, like psychology. And so we can sort of see a carrying on in a lot of institutions that are secular in the United States where people are learning to be spiritual. People have done this for a very long time. This also happens in religion, in religious institutions, that people learn to be spiritual. But there's a really interesting connection of spirituality and secularity. 1 minute, great, I'm just on time then. So I would say, well, what is our evidence for this? And what is our, there's a lot of evidence. For those of you who would think, what is the spirituality? I would say that think about all the atheists you know, perhaps, who say that they are spiritual. I would also say, look, for example, we were talking about this earlier, at Sam Harris's End of Faith, where at the end of his book, which is a critique of religion, nonetheless comes back and says, but we can, in fact, meditate, and that's probably a good thing to do. But he doesn't say we're going to meditate because we're Buddhist. He's going to say we're going to meditate because there's something salutary that he's learned through thinking about science and the science of the mind that makes this a good thing to do. Now, whether or not Sam Harris thinks he's spiritual, many people in the United States who do consider themselves spiritual will not look to the Buddhist text to tell you why it's important to meditate. They will, in fact, tell you that science and science itself is showing us that we are spiritual people at our cores. And this is actually a really even bigger change and has a lot of implications for the ways that Americans think of themselves. Spirituality is, I think, something that's become very naturalized because of science, so that it's very hard now for any American to say, I am not spiritual or religious. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Courtney. Matthew.
So for the first 10 years of my life, I went to church every week with my family. I sang in the choir, the whole bit. I had a firm belief in God, at least until I was 10 or 11, and I discovered a copy of A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. It sparked an interest, and I read more books about the science of the universe, and religion just made less and less sense. So I abandoned my belief in God, and I became a strident young atheist, eager to debate anyone who stooped to put faith in the supernatural. But something was missing in my life. So for a couple of years after giving up God, I occasionally continued to pray at night. I knew there wasn't a recipient, but it made me feel better. And I read books theorizing that perhaps the universe was holistic, thanks to quantum mechanics or extra dimensions. And I sometimes tried to attain some sort of enlightenment through psychedelics. So it would seem that even the most science-minded of us have a desire to believe in something more, and maybe also a tendency. Some skeptics have argued that religion is like a cultural virus that can and should be stamped out with education and rationality. But even as science has progressed over the last few centuries and decades, religion doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Around the world, atheists make up still a small minority of the population. Even in Western countries, they make up a single-digit percentage. Also, psychologists have made a pretty convincing argument that belief in the supernatural is actually natural, either as a byproduct of other cognitive processes, or even as an evolutionary adaptation in itself. So even if you didn't have someone preaching to you out of a sacred text, it seems likely that you would arrive at your own brand of spirituality anyway. So I'm going to briefly touch on 3 common types of spiritual beliefs and possible psychological explanations for them. So one spiritual belief is the sense that everything happens for a reason, that certain things were meant to be, that the universe has plans for us. And this belief in destiny or divine intervention likely comes from the fact that we are very social beings. We're always thinking about the intentions behind events around us. We're saying, who did that and why? And so our social cognition often kicks in even in non-social situations, and we assume design by default. A second common spiritual belief is this New Age belief in the law of attraction, as described in The Secret. The idea is that if you picture success or failure, you will attract it to you. I think this belief in mind over matter or psychokinesis results from a much broader cognitive heuristic or mental rule of thumb that we use for judging causality in general. So if event A happens before event B, and there's some sort of conceptual linkage between the two, you're likely to assume that A may have caused B. And this may happen even if A is merely a thought. So if you think something and then it happens, you may feel some sense of responsibility for the event. A third common spiritual belief is the belief in the soul. We have this sense that the conscious self exists independently of the body and can control the body and might even survive beyond the death of the body. I think this Cartesian dualism results from the illusion of free will, which itself is just an instance of belief in mind over matter. It's mind over controlling the matter of your body. So if you think about lifting your arm and then it lifts, you feel responsible for lifting your arm. So there are also other types of magical thinking that are common and perhaps even universal. For instance, the belief that objects carry essences, which is why we value celebrity memorabilia and family heirlooms, and why you might feel icky wearing a sweater that was worn by a serial killer. And we also believe in the power of symbols, such as voodoo dolls. So think about whether you would feel comfortable cutting up a photograph of your own mother. We're also very superstitious. We use lucky charms and lucky rituals. And we tend to act as though the world were alive, which is why you yell at your laptop, and maybe even hug trees, at least metaphorically. And then beyond magical thinking, there's a broader sense of spirituality that might have nothing to do with belief in the supernatural. So some people define spirituality simply as having a respect for states of transcendence, where you feel an ego loss or a connection with something larger than yourself. Some people pursue these states of transcendence through meditation or drugs or dancing or spending time in nature or going to Burning Man and doing all of the above. So in general, people have a desire for a sense of control over their lives and for a sense of meaning in life. And often people find these in church, and if they don't find it there, then they'll look for it elsewhere.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Alan Miller. Oh, no, sorry, Sally Quinn.
Well, just the fact that I'm here means that I care a lot about this subject because I'm giving up Dancing with the Stars, which is my spirituality, because I dance, and I'm completely hooked on this show.
You can give us a little twirl if you like.
I might. We'll see. So my housekeeper asked me today, of all days, she said, "What are all those elephants statues you have all over the house?" And I said, "Well, those are my Ganeshas." And the Ganesh is the mascot of On Faith, which is my website. And Ganesh is the remover of all obstacles. And Ganesh also is the god of prosperity. It's a Hindu god. Right now, I'm wearing 2 Ganeshas, which I always wear. I only take them off when I go to bed. I have a Ganesh here, and then I have a little tiny Ganesh here. I'm always wearing these. I have 2 evil eyes. There's one in here, and then as my evil eye bracelet, which I never take off. I sleep in it and swim in it and bathe in it. Then I have my buffalo nickel. My father was in the Army, and he gave his regiment the buffaloes, they were called. Everybody got a nickel, and I wear that for good luck. I have a shell for the walk on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, which when the pilgrims would stop by a house that was welcoming, they would put a shell out in front of it. And then I have my labyrinth here, which I walk, and my mother's wedding ring and my wedding rings. And I go nowhere without them. They are constantly with me. So am I superstitious? Of course. Am I spiritual? I think so. Am I religious? I don't know. I don't know what those words mean, and it makes a lot of religious scholars and theologians crazy when people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. It's the one thing that drives them nuts. And I don't understand why, because it seems to me that one, spirituality is a search for meaning, where another is really a belief in doctrines. And to this day, I don't understand why people get upset at what others do or don't believe. It just doesn't make any sense to me. My favorite bumper sticker in the entire world is, I don't know and you don't either. And actually, I wrote this on Faith, and the guy who invented the bumper sticker read it and sent me one. I've got it in my office. But everyone has some superstitions, as Matt has said. Christopher Hitchens, for instance, told me once that if he finds a penny, he considers that good luck and will always pick it up and put it in his pocket. And Richard Dawkins told me that he won't step on a crack because it might break his mother's back, and that he would never, ever sleep in a haunted house because he'd be way too scared. So my religious upbringing was rather odd. My family came from Statesboro, Georgia, which is a tiny southern town near Savannah, and they were Scottish Presbyterians. My Aunt Ruth played the piano in the Presbyterian church. The help, many of whom were former slaves, went to the Baptist church, their Baptist church. However, what we really believed in and practiced was voodoo, psychic phenomena, Scottish mysticism, palm reading, astrology, seances, and ghosts. And I have many, many stories about those, real stories. And those things were my true religion. aside from dancing. Aunt Ruth was psychic, my Aunt Maggie was psychic, and I'm psychic. And so we actually put hexes on people, and they really worked. It was actually scary, and I finally stopped when my brother, who has a PhD in religion from the University of Chicago and is a theosophist and also a practicing Buddhist, told me I had to cut it out because it would come back at me 3 times. And so anything that I did later that was troublesome, I kept thinking, I brought this on myself. I should never have put a hex on her. So you asked me, do I believe all of this? And the answer is yes, I do. It was so ingrained in me as a child that I don't think it'll ever go away. Religion, on the other hand, is different. My father was in the army, and he liberated Dachau, the German concentration camp. And he had his staff photographer take pictures of the bodies and the emaciated people. And he made scrapbooks out of them. And when I saw the scrapbooks when I was about 5 or 6, and I had always prayed every night. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. When I saw those photographs, I realized that there could be no God, and I became an atheist, although I didn't know the word until I was 13. But I've been an atheist most of my life. And, actually, as Matt said, I was an angry atheist. And then I started on faith sort of by accident. I sort of backed into it. And I began to study religion, and I saw some of the good that was done in the name of religion. And I also met many wonderful, brilliant people who were religious and were theologians and scholars. And that changed my mind about many things, and I did stop calling myself an atheist, partly because John Meacham, who was the editor of Newsweek and who is a very religious person, told me, you're not an atheist because you're not a negative person, and that's a way to define yourself negatively. And he also said, you can't talk about this until you know what you're talking about, and you've got to go out and read something. So I did, so I read a lot, it was fascinating, and I learned a lot, and I began to see the positive aspects of religion. However, in my 6 years as running on faith, nobody, of all the people I've interviewed, the people who've written, the people I've talked to, nobody has ever been able to give me an acceptable answer of why there is suffering in the world. And that has always stopped me from being truly religious. I interviewed Rick Warren's wife about a month ago, and I was asking her about this very question, suffering in the world, and she teared up and she said, I don't know, sometimes I think it's all just a great big cosmic joke. And I thought that was really interesting. Oh gosh, 1 minute. So what gives my life meaning? I'd like to say being editor of On Faith, but I have to say that editing a website is about as spiritual as being on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. But really what gives meaning to my life is my husband, my son, his wife, my family, my husband's family, and my friends. And I find myself more and more staying at home and spending time with them since I've been doing the website in small groups rather than wanting to go to big flashy events, which I used to do. I love going to the country on weekends. My house is on the water. I read. I take walks in the woods. I swim. But most of the time, I walk the labyrinth. I have a 50-foot labyrinth in the country. And I don't know whether you all know that. It's a circle where you walk. It's a meditational tool. And I concentrate on a question or something. I stand. I sit. I lie down in the center. Sometimes for hours, I meditate. For hours. In fact, once I was lying down on the labyrinth and this little tiny plane kept circling over, and I knew that the guy thought I was dead. But what I get from the labyrinth is an enormous clarity. Just things seem better after I've walked the labyrinth. I feel renewed. I feel ready to take on the world. And I feel ready to put hexes on anyone who gets in my way. Thank you.
Anyone who was thinking of disagreeing with Sally in the discussion, you may want to rethink your contribution. Alan Miller.
Thanks. Well, there are 3 main points that I think are key to tonight's discussion and the question. The first is that the spiritual but not religious outlook represents the broader unease today with being accountable to a set of ideas or principles to any larger authority. The second is that the spiritual but not religious outlook, or spunners that I'm going to call them for short, retains and keeps the hold of the worst part of religion, the mystical and the superstitious, without the positive affirmation of human action. And thirdly, that spunners represent the fallout that has occurred in the Western world since the end of the Cold War and the moral disorientation of Western society. New atheists also demonstrate this, it seems to me, with their defining point being only that they don't believe. And here they share much of a similar outlook with the spunners. I mean, to see how religious American society actually is, I'm interested in the quote that Professor of Religion Stephen Prothero starts his entertaining book, Religious Illiteracy, with. He tells us that European students can name the 12 apostles and the 7 deadly sins, but they wouldn't be caught dead going to church or synagogue themselves. American students are just the opposite. Here, faith without understanding is the standard. Here, religious ignorance is bliss. Now, while 80% of Americans are registered as Christian, many are changing denominations within that category, and intermarriage faith is increasing today. There has been an increase in the category of nuns, as Courtney quite rightly pointed out, and it seems that alongside the dwindling of mainstream Protestant attendance and Catholic attendance, there's this new group that's identified themselves as spiritual but not religious. Now, when many people attend the now infamous super churches, they seem to be more characterized by a socializing, a drop-in center, networking place, as opposed to an ardent study of scripture. Indeed, having conducted market research, a lot of them found that people were turned off by pushing religious doctrine too much. And ever with an eye on numbers, they toned it down even further to be a place where one can feel better and socialize. Religion is now often discussed in enormously shrill terms on both sides of the Atlantic. New atheists will denounce and insult religious believers, and some use the language of coming out, like gays did, as though they are being oppressed in society. Those in religious quarters, on the other hand, accuse atheists of tearing America apart. Both seem equally misguided. As Thomas Bergler has pointed out in The Juvenilization of American Christianity, increasingly a lot of attention is paid to feelings and peace of mind, as opposed to passing on a body of knowledge and traditions and customs. And while attendees say they enjoy the service, ask them to differentiate between their church's beliefs and others, and often there'll be an uncomfortable silence. So whilst the spunners are comprised of a largely younger demographic, they seem to be put off by a combination of elements, historically, of the religious right, historical accounts of atrocities involving the organised church, as well as recent controversies to do with paedophilia, the culture wars, and ongoing partisan battles, particularly around abortion and gay marriage. Especially strong is the impact science has had, and alongside the declining respect for institutions that's affected the whole of Western society. Now, this latter point is particularly salient and important because the spunners, who often claim that they want to make their own unique and independent choices, they don't want to be labelled by following the rules and traditions of one organisation handed down to them. They want to feel right in the age of being gentler to me. The notion that one would have to work hard, make serious commitments to a set of principles, and live by them seems rejected. Much more attractive, of course, is to have a pick-and-mix approach. A kind of yoga, a bit of yoga here, some Kabbalah classes there, a slice of Taoism, and a few Sufi poems from Rumi, with perhaps a reading from a psychic thrown into good measure. Spiritual but not religious retains all the most superstitious aspects of religion, yet wants not to be held accountable to anything by anybody. There's a particular reaction to what now gets termed the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and Eastern varieties are seen as more acceptable. But just like the lack of religious literacy, few seem to have studied Buddhism or the Hindu Bhagavad Gita in any real depth or detail, but instead refer loosely to generalities such as karma or what characteristics is a turn away from major institutions, similar to we've seen in other institutions and political parties in both America and Europe. Shirking definitions, we never know quite what they believe, what they practice, how or why. And in the end, it represents a fence-sitting position, scared, it seems to me, to declare and commit to either a rational enlightenment outlook of reason and atheism, or a belief and conviction of religious body of thought and prayer. So the new atheists have made such a big noise in recent years, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and others, and they seem particularly outraged by what they consider to be the audacity that anybody should dare to believe in something greater than themselves. In the age of post-ideology, much of the utopianism of the left has evacuated the public stage. the notion that there are people who believe and are committed to something bigger than themselves is almost like a secular blasphemy to them. Richard Dawkins, recently at the DC Rally for Reason, got the atheist crowd going by appealing to them to ridicule religious people, mock them, ridicule them in public, he said. Their beliefs are insane and therefore they should be ridiculed with contempt. It is strange that many of the new atheists' attacks are based on negatives, not on a positive vision of something superior, but rather affiliating together simply on the basis that one doesn't believe. Until very recently, atheism had always represented a part of a much bigger outlook about the world. Those bigger outlooks have all seemed to have disappeared somewhat, and we're left simply with negatives. And this, it seems to me, is where the Spunners and the new atheist share much common ground. Reading Hitchens' God is Not Great or Dawkins on the God Delusion, we're presented with horror stories of religion and how they're responsible for dark atrocities of life, war, the oppression of women and child abuse. And Sam Harris tells us that it's taboo to criticize religious faith in our society, although today it seems like the opposite is really true. Interestingly, he tells us at the end of the faith, I hope to show that the very idea of religious tolerance, born of the notion that every human being should be free to believe whatever he wants about God, is one of the principal forces driving us towards the abyss. And there we have it. While arguing that he's for reason, he swiftly abandons the Enlightenment idea of reason and the idea of tolerance. Tolerance is not favoured by those that consider themselves progressives today that much. There are things that are beyond the pale, and often believers, those that have the audacity to believe in something beyond themselves, are beyond the pale. But interestingly, many of the original sins seem to have been represented by those seen as progressive, but now dressed up in medicalised, therapeutised terms. So sex addiction has replaced lust, and instead of gluttony, we have obesity. They often see humans as being weak and victims, but now do so in secular language. Today, when battles over displaying religious artifacts rage up to the Supreme Court, Chick-fil-A is seen as a bastion of southern backwardness for its views on same-sex marriage, or riots on YouTube to do with the videos on YouTube and Islam, increasing numbers of people are obviously uncomfortable with organised religion. Now, of course, people should be free at all times to criticise and say anything they want about religion, but the inability of many to come up with words and ideas to pose any positive collective alternatives for humanity, both those in the spiritual but not religious camp and new atheists, betrays the hole at the heart of today's current intellectual imagination. There seems to be little progressive in the so-called new spirituality that is increasing both in the US and Europe. And contrary to evolutionary biologists' view, we do not have a built-in innate God need or a gene for belief. In an age where so many believe that humans are mad, bad and dangerous, in need of therapy and destroying the planet and ourselves, or that they're religious wackos, an earlier historical idea of humans as generally positive agents in society and for change has been rejected, and instead there is a strong sense where humans are seen as a problem rather than a general solution to life's challenges. Here too, many who say I'm spiritual but not religious share this outlook with the new atheists, and both, it seems to me, have a downgraded outlook on what is possible in the world.
Okay, thank you. Please give our speakers a round of applause. Okay, I have a few questions for the speakers, just in case we run out of questions, but I don't think we will. We do have microphones, and I do want it to keep moving very quickly, so I'm going to take a round of questions. Where are my microphone people? Okay. So, first of all, I'm going to take the man here in the aisle, and then I'm going to take Todd here in the green shirt.
Mrs. Sally Quinn mentioned people who are crazy when they hear spiritual. I am one of them, but from different reason. You see and you hear me and my language, and connotation for spiritual sound for me megalomaniac, self-glorification, self-admiration. It means I am so high spiritually and rest not so high. Why not to say believer? It covers everything. And after you can go to detail. But spirituality, certainly, it seems to me in every language, has certain connotation. Holy man, somebody on such level. Bach is spiritual. Can somebody else have chutzpah to say this about himself? Of course, in this country, people say very easily, I am determined, I am hardworking. Let somebody else tell about you that you are spiritual. You cannot say this about yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can people put your hands up just so I can see who's looking to speak? Okay, after Todd, I'm going to take the man behind him with the hat, and then I'll take the man here in the aisle.
This is sort of an Alan-style question, but I'd love to hear what anybody had to say about it. This conversation's mostly been about people drifting away from mainstream religion and becoming spiritual and not religious. Do you see any currents toward people becoming religious but not spiritual, in the sense that they jettison all those supernatural claims and mystical beliefs, but are still trying to retain tradition and community? Any odds of humanist organizations or maybe some atheist form of Judaism becoming more popular, or is that just very unlikely?
Okay, the man in the hat, and then the man in the aisle, and then I'm going to take the lady at the front here.
Thank you. This is a question for Alan Miller. I thought you made a lot of interesting points in your presentation. But one thing that bothered me was that it seemed like you were essentializing these SBNR people as a sort of monolithic entity, when exactly the opposite is true in my experience. These are not people who have a sort of doctrine amongst themselves, and they're definitely not uniformly wishy-washy or lacking in intellectual rigor. Granted, they're people with inclinations towards laziness in all segments of the population, but in my experience, these are people who have put a lot more thought than average into the difficult questions in life, and have realized they're very difficult to answer. And people who believe that it's more noble to sit and think about it than to take a reckless and boorish position for the sake of taking one. So I get the sense that you're sort of creating and demonizing a caricature of this community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. After the man in the aisle and the lady at the front, I'm going to go over to this side and take the lady in the very nice purple sweater, and then the man behind her.
Sally Quinn interested me of all the speakers most. She admits to having a bunch of talismans to protect herself, but yet it's interesting to me that she has so many that probably doesn't believe that any of the talismans are that effective. They need a gang to back them up. But what I'm getting at, the question I have, I'm intrigued that she says she can hex people, and she has. And I would like to hear the biggest hit job she ever did.
Okay, the lady at the front. Sally's services are for hire, but you have to arrange that with her privately. Here at the New York Salon and the New School, we do not, condone bumping people off.
It's always been my understanding, and I think all of you have proven me incorrect, that religion in and of itself, innately by its definition, the dictionary definition, which is a belief in the metaphysical or transcendental being, is spiritual. And none of you, unless I missed it, has actually defined spirituality. And I have a suspicion that if all of you gave your definitions, many of them would be different from one another. So I would love to hear each of you define spirituality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The lady in the purple sweater and then the man in the blue behind. Can people keep putting your hands up so I get an idea of who's wanting to speak? Okay.
My best guess would be that all of us would like to be more connected with the divine, with ourselves, and with each other. So I'm wondering what your response would be as to why these labels matter so much.
Okay, I'll take the man behind you. Then I'm going to take the lady who's also wearing a nice purple top next to you, and then the lady at the front here.
I just think that, that it's such a big question, and it's so confusing, and it's so complex, because religion has been such a force of peace and good in the world. At the same time, it's also been a force it's been used in a very terrible way to kill and torture people. So that complexity, I think we have to forgive ourselves for not walking out of here knowing, the answer to this. But I want to bring politics into it because I belong to the Network of Spiritual Progressives, which is an organization that's trying to create a religious left in America to go up against the religious right, which is very powerful and very well developed. And Ronald Reagan, who was, I think the first president elected because of the religious right, claimed to be religious, but was he really religious? If his policies created a lot of, inequities and injustices. We know his wife was into horoscopes, but so what do you think about this political question of, Pat Robertson still has a television show on the air, so the religious right is still very, very well developed, and yet the spiritual left has yet to, I think, find its voice.
Thank you. If you could just pass the microphone round to the lady at the front here.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I am 23 years old. I recently graduated from university. In the Northeast, a large research university, and I saw almost across the board that religion was the uncool thing. And by uncool, I mean more specifically that it wasn't connected with academia and research, particularly scientific inquiry. And so I saw my fellow students that might have come to university religious move quickly away from that. And so I project, and I still see now that we've just graduated, that they're no longer attending church when their parents might still. Many of them are away from their families, and so that ritual is past. But do you see this type of pattern increasing exponentially? Do you think something will happen in our lives that will bring us back to religion? So, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take the lady at the front, and then I'm going to bring the speakers in and ask the speakers to just answer their two favorite questions, because otherwise we will be here all night, because obviously we can continue the conversation. So the lady at the front, yes.
Notwithstanding the cultural lens, which you all speak from, Mary, is that your name? Sorry. Only one person actually brought in an other. She talked about growing up and that there were the slaves that went to the Baptist church. So for the other panelists, in your statements, there is a lot of generalities that I'm not quite sure. Are you only speaking from your cultural perspective? If so, please clarify. Matt, I'm not quite sure on your definition of soul, so if you can clarify that, I think that would be helpful for the conversation in relationship to this lady's questions of spirituality. And if you could speak on ritual and cultural practice as a form of social practice, because Alan, you talked about what people were doing, but not really how they were doing it. So I think in regards to this gentleman's question here in terms of generalities, I think I'm looking for something more concrete from all of you in your analysis, because it's a lot.
No, I think we've got your point. That's great. Okay, I'm going to bring the speakers in for 2 minutes each. So keep thinking about your questions and things that you'd like to say. And when we come back out, I'm going to bring the dean first because he has his hand up. Okay, should we go the other way, Alan?
Okay.
You have 5 pages of notes there. You can only got 2 minutes.
Okay. There was lots of very good questions, so that's difficult. Okay, yeah. Okay, so on the idea that there's a monolithic entity that's not uniform, I mean, a lot of people will make the criticism to me that that's the case, but I think the issue is that that's not something that I've created. What it seems to me is that there's a plethora of these multitude of different ideas and views that are a combination of different elements that have been picked together. And it's not that I'm saying that someone hasn't given that a lot of thought necessarily. What I'm making a very basic point, which is that there's a rejection of the idea of being responsible to a bigger organization or institution in society. That's true of people who are secular and atheist, as well as it is true increasingly for people who see themselves as religious. And that's a lot about like a kind of a significant change that's happened in society, in Western society, where the idea of authority and following rules and your commitment to things has been eroded, and in a way one sort of assumes that, you know, the way to work things out is just to kind of do a pick and mix type thing. So it's not even that it's insulting, but it's not that they're monolithic. The real point is that there are a variety of combinations, and you can't actually get a hold on any of it. Now, if you're being postmodernist about it and saying, well, you know, that's what it's all about, the only true sense of the search for meaning is that you can have no meaning, then we're in a kind of problem, because if we're going to say that nothing has any meaning and it's only really about what your relative view is, then that's a problem. And that has become a real issue in society, the proliferation of several truths, each one being equally valid as the other, is also a reflection of the collapse in belief in society. And I actually think that goes to the heart of many of our problems today.
Okay, thank you. Matthew?
So to answer the question about definition of the soul, there's kind of a colloquial definition that I would sometimes use, and just sort of talking about someone's personality. So like, he has a lot of soul, or, you know, I feel, you know, connected to that person's soul and that sort of thing. But then there's also a more strict definition that I would use in discussing philosophy or metaphysics, which is to believe in the soul is to believe that consciousness can exist independently of the neural substrate, of the brain that gives rise to the consciousness. So that even if someone dies, the person's personality would continue to exist in some other form or some other place. And then to the question about young adults not attending church. Statistics show that young adults attend church less regularly than older adults. And so this might indicate a trend toward people in the future attending church less. This is at least in the United States. But this pattern appears in every generation. So basically, when people graduate, or when they leave their families and their homes, they don't attend church as frequently. They sleep in on Sundays. They slack off. But then once they marry and they have kids, then they start attending church again.
Okay, Sally?
You were talking about the network of spiritual progressives going up against the
microphone.
Oh, sorry, going up against the religious right, and that the religious right is developed. But I think that what we've seen in this campaign is that the religious right has done themselves a huge disservice. I mean, if you look at the primaries, every one of those people, I mean, was referred to as a clown show, but it was appalling. And you look at Aiken, who's running for senator against Claire McCaskill, and it's insane. And they have gone so far to the right that I really think that the progressives are the beneficiaries of this. And there are all kinds of, I mean, I find now, and when I started 6 years ago On Faith, I found that the religious right was a lot stronger than it is now, because I think now it's like, the conservatives owning the American flag, and I think now that the progressives and the liberals are beginning to say we're going to take back religion because it doesn't belong to them, it belongs to everybody. And I would also like to say something about the colleges. One of the problems is that the big universities don't teach religion religiously, and Steve Prothero, you mentioned, wrote a book about religious literacy. Harvard doesn't even have a religion major. They don't have a religion department. You have to, if you want to take religion courses, you have to go to the Harvard Divinity School, and a lot of these kids don't want to because they're graduate schools and they're afraid they may not get the right grades. So the colleges don't, and I don't understand this because I don't think that you can be an informed or educated person unless you understand religion. I mean, look at foreign policy. Look what's going on all over the world, including the Muslim world. Look what's going on in American politics. You've got to understand religion. And that's why it's so scary that so many of these people who are religious don't even understand their own religion, much less anyone else. And the Pew Foundation did a survey, and it turned out that the atheists and the agnostics were more knowledgeable about religion than the actual religious people were.
Courtney.
I think that would be another really good topic, this question of religious literacy, but I'm not going to bite on that one. I think what I want to talk about, or what I would like to address, is this question of when spirituality is something that's always been part of religion. So for the sociologist and the historian in me, the question is, when did it become autonomous? When did spirituality actually get to be something that we could talk about and we could say that we are spiritual, not religious, right? This didn't just sort of this hasn't existed forever. This is a very recent thing. It's basically, we could say in the last 150 years, there's been some wrenching apart of something called spirituality from something called religion. I would say, I have a wonderful friend, colleague, who's written this book called Secularism in Antebellum America, and he shows us, in fact, that the phrenologists in the 19th century located spirituality in the phrenology charts, right? And then, not long afterwards, phrenology sort of goes away, and who cares about that, right? But there are other people, elites and scholars, who are working with this idea that spirituality is something that's interior to us, and that is then very important politically, because it then allows people like William James and people who are involved in the world parliaments of religion in the 1890s to say all of the religions are the same because there's a universal spirituality that unites them. And this was a very important political project in the 19th century and into the 20th to say these religions are not all distinct in the sense of, yes, they're culturally coming out of particular places, but we are all human and we all have religion. But this is something that is very new. I think that we have to take account of the fact that as a historical development and as a political development, this is not a world historical idea. This is something that's really recent. And it's also something that has been buoyed, which you think about this phrenologist locating it in the brain, right? It continues to be carried in the sciences, and particularly in the psychological sciences in particular ways. And so when Matt says, like we say that, irrationality is something that's hardwired, it's different, right? But for me, it also carries a very strong resonance of, I'm thinking about what are the politics of this? I'm thinking about the fact that, for example, the veterans hospitals now give all people who come into veterans hospitals a variety of tests, including a spiritual assessment. When you come in as a veteran, you can opt out of it, but there is something called a spiritual assessment test in addition to a psychological assessment test. And you can actually score poorly on it and get treatment for this from the Veterans Administration Hospital. And when there were some atheists who said, this is an infringement, this is an establishment of religion, the courts said, spirituality is not sectarian. This does not go against the First Amendment. This is not an unfair an unconstitutional establishment of religion because it is spirituality. The Department of Defense at the same time is building labyrinths for for veterans from the wars. And that's a big discussion. Which labyrinth do you use? Do you use the religious one from this tradition or this tradition? Well, it doesn't matter because they're all spiritual, right? So, this stuff is really serious, and it's very much about the individual, of course, but spirituality is an idea. It's something that's carried in institutions, and it's carried in institutions that are very secular. So that's all I'd say.
By the way, I'm going to meet with you afterward to tell you about my best hit.
Please edit that out of the film. Okay, so I'm going to take the dean, and people could start indicating, if they would like to speak. That would be great. Somebody give the man a microphone. Thank you.
Thanks. First of all, I'd like to say that the new school is not responsible for any ill effects of any hexes. I want to push back on something that seems missing to me in the discussion so far, and it was prompted by the last comment, noticing that only Sally Quinn had spoken about others with whom she was in relationship in experiencing her own religious growth. It seems to me there are two really important facts that haven't been fully grappled with. One is, if Courtney's nuns have gone from 8% to 15%, the big news is the 85%. And the persistence of people finding meaning in religious communities and religious institutions, sometimes shallow, sometimes thoughtfully, in a whole diverse range of ways and intensities. And the other big fact, and here, this is something I learned in reading Diana Eck's book, Encountering God, is that because of global migration, everyone now lives in an everyday world where we are constantly relating to people who are rooted in other religious or spiritual communities from ours. And that seems to me absolutely crucial to this, because I actually think people distill and reflect on their own meaning-making in dialogue and in friction and in push-pull with that diverse, polyglot, polyfaith everyday life that they have. I don't think that the way they normally answer these questions is in an isolated quest where they test kind of existential propositions. It's by the coworker next to you who who believes in Joseph Smith's golden plates, or the fact that I fasted all day on Wednesday in synagogue. That relationality seems to me absolutely crucial to the way we live this meaning making.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the lady over there, and then I'm going to take the man at the back. But one other thing to think about, and you can answer this question only if you want to, is one of the confusions I have. You may or may not know that I'm originally from Europe, and in Europe, people, whether or not you're religious, it's not really a big thing. And the thing that I find quite interesting about the US is that when you're speaking with people, they would rather you were any religion than no religion. And all of the studies show that, despite, certain feelings, certain negative feelings some people have towards Muslims, people would rather, not that there's anything wrong with being a Muslim, but that people would rather you were a Muslim than that you had no faith, that you said you were an atheist. And I do think there's something, particular about the US and US development that, which is different to Europe. So that's just something to think about. Okay, the lady there you are, yes. Another lady in purple.
It's the color for today.
Yeah, it certainly is.
I think my question or comment is closely based on that assessment of U.S. and Western being slightly different than the rest of the world. Do you perhaps, or any of you, find that some of the lack of connection to a specific religion also embodies this sense of not wanting to be accountable or responsible for the ills of that religion? So, and there is the growing of spirituality and a belief in something, but not necessarily wanting to have that specific connotation of the religion and all of the ills that come with that religion, and then therefore having to be responsible or accountable for how your faith can, embody all of the goods, where there's also so many negatives that come along with that. And perhaps the easier, more favorable route is to take spirituality, and in essence, you can still have that faith and not necessarily have to give it a specific title.
Okay, thank you. I'll take the man at the back, and then I'm going to take the man down here who's been very patient.
I think we have to look at developments in religion as a social phenomenon, and it's subject to the bigger social trends. And I think in the most kind of big picture of what's been going on in the last couple of decades has been a decline in the sense of the human potential, what we could achieve. We conceive of humans as more as frail rather than robust, in need of therapy. rather than to stand on your own. We think of humans more subject to limitations of nature, that actually humans destroy nature, and that we need to sort of bow before and accommodate to that. So when we have a low opinion of humans, you would have thought that religion would benefit, because historically there's been this counterposition there. You'd say, you know, humanism versus religion. But what's kind of ironic is that from the standpoint of organized religion, Christianity, Judaism, for instance, it's suffered as well, because actually at the core of those religions actually was a belief in the human, even if it took a form that was a religious form. It was really, there's a, as was referenced, you know, there's a complexity of the moral code. There's a definite social aspect to it, which is kind of developed as society developed, as capitalism developed. You see the development of these religions. And so I think that what you're seeing now in the development of what's called spiritualism, or even the trends within the organized religions toward this way, we ought to really recognize as a negative thing. It's a kind of really a turning inward. And even if it's done in groups, it's highly individualistic. It's what Christopher Lasch would call the culture of narcissism. And not to sort of then pick on people who I think see themselves as spiritual in the same way that I wouldn't agree with a new atheist. What really, instead of identifying, you know, superstition and calling that out, I think what we really need to do is to start at the beginning, which is to reestablish faith in humanity and show what we can do and emphasize in a practical way because in that way, that's how we'll overcome all the superstition we're seeing today.
Okay, thank you. Can I see everybody who wants to speak, because we're running out of time? Okay, I'm going to take, there's a lady right at the back who, I think I'm seeing things now. I thought she had a purple sweater on. And then I'm going to take the man, sorry. No, I'm going to take you in a minute. And I'm going to take you next. And then I'm going to take the lady at the back. And then I'm going to take the man here with the bracelet on. Sorry. Please.
Yeah, I just want to deal briefly with the reinterpretation of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It seems to me that Korzybski, who talked about general semantics, talked about how people take words very seriously. Sometimes they don't even understand what other people are talking about, but they still take the words very seriously. And it also seems that people identify themselves with either a religion or a state. And once they do, then they decide that they're different from anyone who identifies themselves with a different religion or state. And then they kill the people that are from another religion or state. So it seems to me that when God punished the people for being too prideful by creating a Tower of Babel where people had different languages and couldn't understand each other, he really wasn't punishing them. He was really giving them a gift so they would never kill each other. And so what I'm asking is, should we recommend a new world standard language that's so difficult that no one can learn it, so there will no longer be any killing because of religion or national identity?
Okay, thank you. So the lady right at the back, and then the man here with the bracelet on. There you go.
I recently spoke with a friend who just moved to London, and she has 3 children, and she said, my youngest, who's 6, was reading to me what the speech she was going to make in front of school, and she started out with, thank you to God for, and my friend's not religious at all, and we were both sort of like, oh my God, and I said, what did you do? Did you forbid her to talk in the assembly? And she said, no, I couldn't, and she asked her husband, who is British, and he said, there's no separation of church and state here. And I thought that doesn't make any sense as any kind of explanation for that. So I guess my question is, because I know lots of people from Great Britain and from Europe, and they seem less religious in a sense than we are here. So I sort of wondered if that wasn't sort of an example. He was just like, it's accepted. You're allowed to talk about God and things like that in the assembly and in school. And I wondered if that wasn't an example of perhaps Europe being quicker to move towards spirituality but not religious than America is.
Okay. The man just here, and can I just see, you know, who else wants to speak? We've got time for just a couple. I'm going to take the lady sitting next to the man with the bracelet, and then I'm going to take the lady at the back with the blonde hair, and then I'm going to bring it back to the speakers.
Why is it that religion has such a bad rap? I feel in the room religion is looked down upon, and you said religion just isn't cool. And other than Professor Bender, it seems that the whole panel is anti-religion. I've had an opposite experience. I have practiced yoga, New Age meditation, was a Quaker for many, many years. Decided I would take some courses in theology and early Christianity, and 10 years later I've ended up with 2 master's degrees and a PhD in theology and converted to Orthodox Christianity. I've totally embraced religion. I love religion. Why religion is so negative and awful?
Okay, the lady at the back, and then I'm going to come back to the speakers with the... Oh. Oh, yes, yes, and then yes.
I guess my comment or question relates to the young woman over there talking about people in college environments and the dropping of religion. And I'm coming at that, to preface this, I have never been raised in a religious environment. My parents were raised religious, and when they had kids, were basically like, we're not going to do anything. And if they're interested in it, we'll let them pursue it, and it never engaged me, and so I never pursued it. But there seems to, I've noticed that as well. I graduated from college 2 years ago. People sort of getting to college, getting away from their family environment, and going, oh, this isn't working for like what I want to be doing right now. But it also seems to me that there's a, and I say this like, I realize it's strange coming from the perspective I'm coming from, but there's a certain level of narcissism involved in dropping out. You know, there's a certain degree of like, what I want to do is more important than what some institution wants me to do or what a tradition wants me to do. So I guess just maybe if any of you have thoughts on that idea.
Okay, the lady here.
A couple of you have touched on the idea of religion and or spirituality being sort of hardwired into what it means to be a human being. Some positive and some very emphatically negative, saying it's not the case. But I'm interested to hear what you would have to say about the evolutionary psychologists who have been doing research, such as David Sloan Wilson, saying that there is a place for religion in the evolution of social behavior and how it's hardwired into what it means to be a social animal, not only a human, and it's emblematic of that. And also some of the neurobiologists who have been investigating the identifiable neurological events that we correlate with spiritual experience, the neurotheology research that's been going on, and how that figures into how you define spirituality and whether it's just something very basic to being human.
Okay, well, thank you for all your comments and questions. I'm going to bring the panel in now. For those of you who want to continue the discussion, there's 2 things. First one, very important, is those of you who are interested, we are going to Gradisco for a drink, which is on West 13th between 6th and 7th Avenue. And you can also continue the conversation by Twittering, and the Twitter thing is pound Battle of Ideas. Okay, pound Battle of Ideas. So I'm going to ask the speakers to sum up in 2 minutes. Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in.
Good job, Matt.
So you raised the topic of differences between the U.S. and Europe in terms of religion or church attendance. Ironically, it seems that the separation of church and state in the United States actually increases church attendance compared to Europe. Because in England, for instance, there's the Church of England, so they have state funding and they have a monopoly. Whereas in the U.S., churches are independent, so they're basically competing for customers or parishioners.
Please, no heckling, no heckling.
So they're more motivated to market and to bring in more people, and maybe even tone down some of the liturgy to water it down and make it more inviting to people. And then related to that, in the U.S., there's the increased religiosity makes us more prejudiced against atheists. So, for instance, in '97, there was a Gallup poll showing that a minority of people would vote for an atheist president. Fewer people would vote for an atheist president than for an Hispanic president or a Jewish president or a gay president. So, you know, there was the strongest prejudice was against atheists. And a recent study done at the University of British Columbia shows that this prejudice is not because people dislike atheists, it's because they distrust atheists. And they explain this by saying that religious people think that other people are better behaved when they fear God, when they think that there's a God monitoring them. And so if you think that there's an atheist who doesn't fear God monitoring them, then the atheist is not going to behave morally. And so that leads to a distrust of atheists. So then I also just wanted to address the evolutionary psychology and the neuroscience of religion. So David Sloan Wilson advocates group selection, which is a controversial topic, and most scientists don't believe in group selection. But there are other evolutionary explanations for religion. For instance, the idea that perhaps we've evolved to believe in God because it makes us better behaved, and so that we are more paranoid, and because the cost of misbehaving when someone is the cost of being caught misbehaving is so great that it pays to overestimate the chance that someone or something is looking down on you that could, you know, punish you. And then in terms of neuroscience, the neuroscience of spirituality, there are studies showing that activity in the temporal cortex, for instance, seizures, or when they prod that part of the brain with electricity during surgery, that can cause mystical experiences, and prodding the temporal parietal junction can cause out-of-body experiences. So there are direct neural correlates of strong spiritual experiences. And you could say that that means that it's all in your brain, which is my interpretation, but then some people are saying that just means that that is the part of the brain that God touches, that God activates. So it doesn't, you know, you can interpret it either way.
Okay, thank you. Sally.
Yeah, I just would like to answer your question about, oh, sorry. I'd like to answer your question about why is religion get a bad rap? And you think the whole panel is anti-religion, and I didn't come away with that view at all. I think we're all sort of sitting here trying to sort of figure it out. I think that there's only one reason why people are anti-religion, and it's because of the religious people who are religious who say my way or the highway. And I think that if serious people, religious people of all faiths would say, this is what I believe and whatever you believe is fine, I don't think people would be anti-religion. I think it's as simple as that. I would also like to talk about religion in Europe. A friend of mine, Karen Armstrong, who writes, who's a theologian, writes about religion, said that she lives in England and London, and she said whenever she gets invited to a dinner party that her hostess will call and say, now, Karen, I just want you to promise you will not talk about religion because it turns everybody off. And I think that religion is not a big thing in Europe, as we have seen. And the British ambassador to Washington said to me a couple of years ago, he said, I just don't get this in the United States. He said, it's all about religion. I mean, the politics is all about religion. He said, it's just, I've never seen anything like it. He was completely stunned by how religious this country was, or how it seemed to be religion. And, right when you talk about people being more appreciative of others, even if they have a different religion, rather than atheists, they would choose someone else. Jim Wolfenson, who was head of the IMF, who is Jewish and very observant, and he negotiated with Arabs in the Middle East, and always they would be extremely respectful of him because he was such a religious person and so observant. So I thought that was interesting. I think when you said, in this country, honestly, what I've discovered is that a lot of people who say they're religious are not really religious. They think that you need to be in this country because otherwise you will not be accepted. And atheists have a bad name because of some of the sort of more radical and fundamentalist atheists, although they hate that word. But I think that people like Dawkins and Hitchens have done a great service because they are allowing people to come out and say that they're nuns or whatever else they are. Before that, you had this awful Madalyn Murray O'Hair was the sort of atheist emblem of this country. People hated her. And now you've got normal people saying, I'm an atheist, or I'm an agnostic, or I just don't have any religion at all. And I think that that's really helpful and healthy because it allows all of us to say what we believe or what we don't believe. And I did a panel with a bunch of atheists recently, and I said that about Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and some of them went crazy. How could you say that? She's a saint. She's fabulous. She's wonderful. But what I said was, look, you have to start doing good works. You can't just sit there and criticize other people who are religious. You've got to go out and do things. I mean, one of the things that religions do that's good is that they're very charitable. They take care of the naked and the hungry and the poor and all of that. And you can't just being an atheist doesn't work, and it turns people off. So go out and start charities and all of that, and then come back and talk about how you're a good, moral, decent person, and look what you've done, and you're not a believer.
Alan.
Yeah, just briefly on what's different with America and Europe and how it came about. I mean, historically, obviously the development of the nation states in Europe were very different, and religion was very intertwined in that formally as part of the state, whereas the creation from the early colonies and then, the creation of the American nation involved political and religious exiles back from the Reformation, and then it was been woven into a different outlook originally in America to how it was in states in Europe. I think now what's very interesting and fascinating to me is in Europe, if you talk about Americans, there's a very anti-Americanism everywhere, that if you did it to anyone else, you'd be accused of being racist or outraged. For any group, really sexist, people would be outraged. But when you talk about Americans, it's fine to say they're dumb, they're all stupid, none of them know any geography, they're all, and they talk about religious people like this more than anyone else. And it fits in with a kind of intolerant anti-humanism, it seems to me, where a hocus-pocus stupidity is presented as being generally American. I think the point that was brought up at the back was I definitely go along with it. The idea of humans being at the centre of society, and in a way we've lost our belief in humans. If you think about the secular humanist belief that was very popular for the 20th century, the idea that we can create the world and be human agents for change, that impacted everyone. It had an impact, obviously, on religion, but particularly the idea that you could change the world in a positive way and be agents for change. You talk to people about those ideas today, they're thoroughly nervous about that idea. And in fact, one of the things that's become like a secular religion is environmentalism, where what we're told is that, basically I've got a kid, he comes back from school, he tells me he doesn't like cars now because the flood is going to flood the world and it's killing everyone. And that's not presented as an opinion, that's presented as a fact. It strikes me that many things that are presented as secular things today are far more concerning to anyone who sees themselves as a humanist than people of faith or religion. Ironically, the culture war says we have to be very fearful of this religious intolerance and everything. I think today, many more people of faith seem to have at least some sense of human free will. I know Matt says there isn't necessarily such a thing as free will in that respect, but they might have much more sense of that than people who say that they're progressive. I think where it gets to the evolutionary psychologists, neuroscience, is fascinating, because in this area in particular, we're consistently told we're hardwired. And this is another area where, you know, the secular outlook has come to predestine the idea of humanity. Raymond Tallis has countered these ideas in a very interesting book called Aping Humans. But he uses terms neuromania and Darwinitis. It's almost like for everything today, there's a hardwiring for it. So the idea of human consciousness and rational engagement with the world, and being able to think abstractly and engage in the world and make decisions and collectively argue and be involved in a process of winning ideas or saying this is better and best, is kind of suspended to the idea that we've got these genes or we've got these predispositions like a robot. And actually, you know, it's interesting because he makes the point about shouting at computers in that book. And, you know, we anthropomorphize computers like we end up talking about humans as robots. And I think the outlook of evolutionary psychologists is a real problem in terms of people who think that we can actually shape the world and put it at the bottom of it. Just a point on some of the, just a final point on ideas and values. I mean, I think it's still worth, you know, it's interesting times we live in, because I'm an atheist, but I find myself increasingly predisposed to defending or the attacks on people that seem very small-minded against religion. But the ideas of justice and integrity and loyalty and honor and commitment, those ideas are, you know, Enlightenment ideals that we can put into the heart of where humans go in terms of science, wealth creation, technology. Those types of ideas to me seem to be really the human project, and should be ones that people who are really interested in humanity would be really championing.
Courtney.
I don't know if I have that much to add. I have been sitting here and thinking about what I would say at the summing up at the end. I guess in responding to these comments, so I'll try to be brief. I think that the questions about pluralism and the questions about the other and the questions about a religion versus something else point to the ways, just as an observation I'm guessing, that talking about spirituality is no less a discourse about difference and the politics of difference than talk about religion is. So whether we talk about this psychologically or philosophically, or if we use personal stories, or we think about generations or any of these other things, we really are talking about the politics of difference. So is spirituality something that we all have, or is it something that is all distinct and is pulling people apart? Is spirituality something that's narcissistic and pulling from you know, the worst sort of debased Orientalism, where you're pulling a little bit of yoga in and a little bit of this and just sort of laying waste to all these different, you know, unique cultures? You know, is that a bad thing? Is that, you know, is that maybe salutary because you're really, you know, bringing all these things together and showing the true humanity of it? You know, these are, you know, whether Europeans with their ambient faith and their public utility, you know, civil religion are in fact more tolerant than the Americans who have to duke it out without all of these, this nice sort of tolerant civil religion. I would say that the Americans look at the Europeans and say, at least some Europeans, I'm not going to say all of them, and say, look at how unbelievably vexed Europe is when dealing with difference. You know, Americans, we know how to do this. We know how to look at religious difference. We know how to deal with toleration. We have our languages of pluralism. We can figure it out politically. And it's the Europeans who haven't been able to figure out what to do with Islam. And they're the ones who, you know, oh my goodness, what did the French do? They, in fact, trounce people's religious liberty by not allowing women to wear headscarves, for example, and so on. So these are I'm not going to state which side, you know, is a right or wrong side, but just to take an observation that all of these conversations about religion or spirituality are at the end really ways that we talk about politics of difference on a geopolitical level and in incredibly intimate ways. So we can search for meaning, but all the searches for meaning that we have are so heavily laden with these understandings of who we are in a political, little p and big P political world. So that's what you guys have gotten me thinking about again this evening. So thank you for a really nice time.
Just before we thank the speakers, I also want to make sure that we thank all of the New School volunteers and our sound guy and our film guy. So let's just thank everybody.